This stuff. Okay, we're supposed to wave my hand to do. What does that mean? That's so we get captured on deathless videotape. Is it ready? Can you hear? Yes. My name's Greg Walsh. I'm an instructor here, but you don't want to hear me talk so long, so I won't talk very long. Hopefully as short as possible. I'm introducing Professor Bruno Queysanne. Bruno is that rarity today. He's a generalist. He's an expert on things like the Palio, that horse race in Siena. He's the honorary member of a contrada in Siena. He also is an honorary citizen of the city of Pienza, which is also in Italy, although he's French. And he's also an expert in the subject that probably you might expect him to know, philosophy. I met Bruno for the first time a couple of years ago in Prague. And I was taking a group through Germany and Czechoslovakia at the time. We wound up in Prague, and he said, "I'll meet you at the Modest Restaurant." And the Modest Restaurant at the time was kind of a decrepit, modernist building that was a bridge over a part of the river Moldau. And this was the time when the Czechs really didn't want to serve anybody dinner, and it was kind of, you had to wander in, and Bruno wasn't anywhere to be seen. So we wandered in. There was a large table and a huge glass window and an operatic stage set view of Prague in the background. And the sunset, it wasn't the famous buildings of Prague, it was just 19th century buildings overlooking the water. And the light got more and more intense and more beautiful. And Bruno arrived, and nobody said anything about Prague. He didn't introduce, there was no historical introduction, no fancy discussions about anything. We just had dinner, and the mood sort of pervaded the atmosphere. There was a huge grand piano there. Some of us started tinkling, fiddling with it, including Bruno, who also plays jazz, among his other accomplishments. Anyway, this is kind of the way I met him, and this is the way I think of Bruno. As he teaches both here, he teaches at Vico mostly, and I see a lot of his ex-students here. He teaches by indirection. He doesn't force it down your throat. He says, okay, here it is, and you decide. I probably should mention a few little details about his life. He was born in Morocco, and he came to France and went to the Sorbonne, graduated in philosophy, found himself teaching in the mid-60s at the Beaux-Arts, in the School of Architecture, and just in time to be one of the leaders of the revolution that dissolved the Beaux-Arts as a centralist school and dissociated it. From there, he pursued a dream of his life, which, as he tells me, is to work in the city, but to live in the mountains. And so that led him to the University at Grenoble in the south of France, and also to live in a ski resort where, coincidentally, he's been, I believe, mayor of the village of Champmer, where he lives, and also to run the organization that makes sure that the ski trials and games that take place there. So we're talking about a lot of diversity here. But anyway, just as an idea of a few of Bruno's accomplishments, he will tell you much more specifically and show you much more specifically about what he is and what he does. May I introduce Professor Bruno Queysanne.
Thank you. Could we have some light before this? So thank you very much, Greg, for this warm introduction, and thank you to SCI-Arc for inviting me and to give me the opportunity to come back to Los Angeles, back and to study and to learn from this city. So tonight I would like to present you a moment in my personal research. And you understand how much it's personal, because this confrontation of Wittgenstein, a philosopher, and Loos, an architect, is something very intimate for me, because I am a philosopher, but in touch with architecture since 20 or 30 years. I am not still an architect, but I would like so much to be. I have not the courage to be. Wittgenstein, so the philosophers, and Loos, both they are from Wien. Wien, at the beginning of 20th century, has been, I don't know, by chance, but the center of modernity. If you can imagine that you had architects like Otto Wagner, Loos, and so many others, philosophers like Wittgenstein and others, musicians, Schoenberg, Berg, painters, Klimt, Schiele, Kokoschka, writers, Musil, and it was an incredible concentration of energies which, to my opinion, gave birth to, and Freud, and Sigmund Freud, you know, psychoanalysis, new music, new thought in all the fields of civilization. And by chance, or the new political conditions, Prague, where Loos built a wonderful house, the Villa Muller, in 2930, and Wien, in which Wittgenstein built a house for his sister, now are open to the public. So we can make, visiting these two cities and these two buildings, we can make kind of experimentation in architecture. Not only by thinking, reading, but by comparing buildings. These two buildings, the house, the Wittgenstein house in Wien and the Muller house in Prague, are from the same period, 26-28 for the Wittgenstein house and 29-30 for the Loos house in Prague. And I used to go there with SCI-Arc students, you know, and from these twin cities, Prague and Wien, were the capital of the Austrian Empire for centuries, you know, we learn a lot. And also the fact that Wittgenstein, the philosopher, has been involved into a design and the building of a house, and that Loos, the architect, was also a writer, a thinker, and somehow a philosopher. So to put them together and to compare and to learn from their experiences is something which is so rich. And there is something in common, underground, I would say, it's the question of cladding. You know that cladding, so this kind of coat that we apply to a structure, is a kind of cloth, a garment for the building. And even if in English, cladding is not spelled like clothing, like what happened in French with vêtements and revêtements, in Italian with rivestimento for the cladding and vestito for the clothes, or in German, Bekleidung for the cladding and Kleidung for the dress. In English also, finally, cladding and clothing are the same word. Cladding is just an old version of clothing from Old German, Old Dutch. So DD of cladding is equivalent to TH of clothing. This question was, in the theory of Loos, very important. He wrote an essay, The Principle of Cladding. And it is a bit surprising because he wrote also his most famous essay, Ornament and Crime. And if we don't think seriously about the question of cladding, we can consider the cladding as a sort of ornament, something that we add to the structure, that we add to the wall. The ornament is something that we add. There is a primary structure, and then we make a decor. We add something, and so we adorn. We want, in order to give some beauty to the thing, we add the ornament. And the cladding appeared also as something that we add. So it's very amazing that the same architect, Loos, launching a big battle against the ornament after the 19th century, in which, ornament was flourishing everywhere. The same was advocating for the cladding. So I guess in architecture it's a very important question, crucial question, to understand the difference in between cladding and ornament. So cladding is close to clothing. And that will relate the question with Wittgenstein, because Wittgenstein was very much interested by the question of the clothing. We will see that. So there is a kind of underground connection in between Loos and Wittgenstein by their common interest in the way human beings are dressed. And we have to, if we want to understand, I would say, the importance of the question, we have to remember that a very old tradition, since the Greek and since Vitruvius telling us what the Greek thought about architecture, and after Vitruvius in Renaissance times and in 18th century Enlightenment, etc., and even today, I would say, there has been a preeminence in conceiving the architecture, a preeminence given to the structure. What is there and what is the thing that we have to add something to give him some fantasy, some beauty. So the primacy of the structure is something which is founded in our history since centuries. And this primacy has taken the form of a tale or of a myth, which is the myth of the rustic hut, primitive hut. So the question of the human beings inventing architecture by imitating something which has been offered by nature. And we know that for centuries, and especially in the classical times and in ancient, antique times, in Greek and Roman times, an art had some value when he was able to demonstrate that he was a good imitation of nature. And what was easy to understand in painting or in sculpture, because nature gave the model, the human body, the face that the artist imitates, was very difficult to find in architecture, because what the architectural project is imitating. The nature is not giving directly something to imitate for the architecture. So either architecture is not an art if art has to imitate nature, or we have to find how architecture is able to imitate something coming from nature. So the invention of that myth, you know, the first human beings taking some elements from nature and transforming them into a structure, a wood structure, this primitive hut, and then transforming them into the marble or stone Greek temple. So all that story was necessary to found the quality of architecture as an art in demonstrating that architecture is imitating an original model coming from nature. I would like just to read you the most famous development expression of that myth by the French Abbé Logier, a Jesuit of 18th century at the moment of the Enlightenment. And his version with the engraving of his treatise is famous, you know, and is really the base for the thinking of architecture in 19th and even, I guess, in 20th century. So it's just a story. On the banks of a quietly flowing brook, so the man, he noticed a stretch of grass. Its fresh greenness is pleasing to his eyes. Its tender down invites him. He is drawn there and stretched out at leisure on his sparkling carpet. He thinks of nothing else but enjoying the gift of nature. He lacks nothing. He does not wish for anything. But soon the scorching heat of the sun forces him to look for shelter. Nearby forest draws him to his cooling shade. He runs to find a refuge in his depth, and there he is content. But suddenly, mists are rising, swirling round and growing denser until thick clouds cover the skies. Soon, torrential rain pours down on this delightful forest. The savage, in his leafy shelter, does not know how to protect himself from the uncomfortable damp that penetrates everywhere. He creeps into a nearby cave, and finding it dry, he praises himself for his discovery. But soon the darkness and full air surrounding him make his stay unbearable again. He leaves and is resolved to make good by his ingenuity the careless neglect of nature. He wants to make himself a dwelling that protects but does not bury him. Some fallen branches in the forest are the right material for this purpose. He chooses 4 of the strongest, raise them upright, and around them in a square. Across their tops, he lays 4 other branches. On these, He hoists from two sides yet another row of branches which, inclining towards each other, meet at their highest point. He then covers this kind of roof with leaves so closely packed that neither sun nor rain can penetrate. Thus, man is housed. Admittedly, the cold and heat will make him feel uncomfortable in this house which is open on all sides, but soon he will fill in the space between two posts and feel secure. Such is the course of simple nature. By imitating the natural process, art was born. All the splendors of architecture ever conceived have been modeled on the little rustic hut I've just described. It is by approaching the simplicity of this first model that fundamental mistakes are avoided and true perfection is achieved. The pieces of wood set upright have given us the idea of the column. The pieces placed horizontally on top of them, the idea of the entablature. The inclining pieces forming the roof, the idea of the pediment. This is what all masters of art have recognized. But take note of this. Never has a principle been more fertile in its effect. From now on, it is easy to distinguish between the parts which are essential to the composition of an architectural order and those which have been introduced by necessity or have been added, so the notion of addition by caprice. The parts that are essential are the cause of beauty. The parts introduced by necessity cause every license. The parts added by caprice cause every fault. Let us never lose sight of our little rustic hut. I can only see columns, a ceiling or entablature, and a pointed roof forming at both ends that is called pediment. So far, there is no vault, still less an arch, no pedestals, no attic, not even a door or window. I therefore come to this conclusion: in an architectural order, only the columns, the entablature, and the pediment may form an essential part of its composition. So here you have a really strict, definition of what is architecture. It's the structure. Even what we consider as necessary, windows, doors, enclosures, are secondary. Even what is added for necessity of living it is causing trouble in that beautiful structure. And what we add for the fancy, is worst. And as architects, it's still an issue which is present, that the architecture has to express itself and to tell the truth about itself, and to tell the truth about its structure. All what we add to the structure is more or less disturbing. And that comes from Logier, that comes from Vitruvius, this idea that the structure is primary, and all what we add to make the structure livable, by human beings, is a cause of disturbances. As if architecture was condemned, in order to be efficient, to be a shelter for human beings, to betray its origin, its purity. As if architecture was condemned to never keep the quality of its origin, because the structure, which is the only source of beauty, cannot be used only by itself for being a shelter. So we are forced to add, and so the architecture and the architect would be condemned, to betray what they have to serve. And this concept, of the primacy of the structure is absolutely, not absolutely, but is dominant since centuries. So it's absolutely intriguing to take seriously what Adolf Loos called the principle of cladding. And when he is introducing to this issue, he is proposing himself a kind of myth of the origin of architecture. So I'm reading Loos now. The architect's general task is to provide a warm and livable space. Carpets are warm and livable. He decides for this reason to spread out one carpet on the floor and to hang up four to form the four walls. You see the difference between the Logiers or Vitruvian myth. He was starting by erecting poles, and now we are spreading and erecting carpets. But you cannot build a house out of carpets. Both the carpet on the floor and the tapestry on the wall require a structural frame to hold them in the correct place. To invent this frame is the architect's second task. So that means the structure in that myth, or what I consider as a myth, becomes secondary. What is primary is the shelter, the wrapping, the envelope of the space. And then that is which has to be put on the first place. Second place, the structure. This is the correct and logical path to be followed in architecture. It was in this sequence that mankind learned how to build. So the myth, mankind learned to build on the opposite way of that proposed by Logier and Vitruvius. In the beginning was cladding. So that's the character of a narrative, of a myth, In the beginning was cladding. Man sought shelter from inclement weather and protection and warmth while he slept. He sought to cover himself. The covering is the oldest architectural detail. Originally, it was made out of animal skins or textile products. This meaning of the word is still known today in the German language. So textile products for Kleid and Kleidung, Bekleidung. Then the covering, so the covering is Bekleidung in German, is cladding. Then the covering had to be put up somewhere if it was to afford enough shelter to a family. Thus, the walls were added, which at the same time provided protection on the sides. You see the complete opposite way of thinking. First we have the structure, and then we add and we hang carpet to close. Now we have first the textile which surround the space, and we add to them the walls. So the structure is now added. There are architects who do things differently. Their imagination creates not spaces, but sections of walls. That which is left over around the walls then form the rooms. And for these rooms, some kind of cladding is subsequently chosen. But the artist, the true architect, first senses the effect that he intends to realize and sees the rooms he wants to create in his mind's eye. He senses the effect that he wishes to exert upon the spectator. These effects are produced by both the material and the form of the space. So what is first is the qualification of the space that you want to build. And you give some meaning to it. And you decide in advance, you forethink, with your mind's eyes, what you are doing when you do a project. Building is not built, but nevertheless, as an architect, you can imagine, you can foresee it. And what you foresee is not the structure first, but the ambiance, the atmosphere, the feeling that you want the people to have in these spaces. So the carpets, the textiles, in their softness, in their ability to produce various meanings first, so the space, I would say the void, the emptiness, and then after, to make these standing, the wall. And so the wall is added now to the cladding, to the covering, to the clothing of the space. And Loos honestly recognized that in fact he borrowed from Gottfried Semper, a great architect and theoretician of mid-19th century, this idea of the cladding, of the principle of the cladding. The principle of cladding, which was first articulated by Semper, extends to nature as well. Man is covered with skin, the tree with bark. So it's a path on which we see how much architecture is considered as a covering, as a clothes, a garment, The first one being the skin, protecting and wrapping our flesh and bones. And so after the cladding of the architecture, of the space in which the body is developing his movement, his gesture. It is at this moment that I meet Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, was a philosopher of logic, mathematics, analyzing the language with very strict and strong structural approach. But he was also very much keen with the daily life, the problem of how we speak in the daily life communication, and not only in a very sophisticated one of the mathematician, of logician, and also how we behave into the space. And so Wittgenstein, and that's really surprising. When we read Wittgenstein, to see how much he was, I would say, fascinated by the body and its possibility to move and to express and to communicate by gesture. And the body, as we saw in Loos, is first covered by his skin and then by his clothing and then by architecture. So from one collected statements by Wittgenstein in Culture and Value, the book Culture and Value, we have that. The queer resemblance between a philosophical investigation, perhaps especially in mathematics, so something strange for us and for me, a philosopher, that to be identified with mathematics, which was true for Wittgenstein, but not in general. So, the queer resemblance between a philosophical investigation, perhaps especially in mathematics, and an aesthetic one. So first, that is surprising, this connection that he established in between philosophy, mathematics, and aesthetics. Most of the time, realms which are strongly divided. And then he gave an example. For instance, what is bad about this garment, how it should be, how it should fit, how it should suit, I would say. So, we pass from philosophy to mathematics, then aesthetics, and what is the example which is illuminating the statement is the question of the garment, just the fashion, how to cut, to tailor something in order to make it fitting. And in English you have this game of words of suit, how a suit suits, And so that Wittgenstein references when he is thinking about what is correct, what is true, what is making philosophy, mathematics, and aesthetics being alike. The reference, the ground, the common ground of that is the tailoring, the cutting of a garment. And then, remember the impression one gets from good architecture, that it expresses a thought. So good architecture is related to thinking, and we can easily accept that and be proud of it. Architecture is a kind of embodiment of philosophy. But what happens after is really surprising. It makes one want to respond with a gesture. So that we can accept and understand for the understanding of architecture that the best way to understand an architecture is to make gestures, to move into it, to move with it. But for Wittgenstein, this is a paradigm to understand also philosophy. A good thought is a thought to which we want to respond, not by words, not only by a thought, but by a gesture. So first statement, quotation, the question of the garment, and now the arrival of the gesture. And the gesture in Wittgenstein philosophy, or in the second maybe Wittgenstein philosophy, is really the point. It's the model that we have to understand in order to understand the world, the relationship that we have with the world. He said, architecture is a gesture. Not only we have to respond to it by a gesture, but architecture is a gesture. And he was very liking music. He played music also. For me, this musical phrase is a gesture. So music also is a gesture. And we understand that all the world is a gesture. So the connection of Wittgenstein with the pragmatic philosophy, because pragma means action, So the philosophy is nothing but something which invites to act, to perform, to make gestures. For me, this musical phrase is a gesture. It insinuates itself into my life. I adopt it as my own, So the movement of the music becomes my own movement. Understanding and explaining a musical phrase. Sometimes the simplest explanation is a gesture. On another occasion, it might be a dance step, so it's still a gesture, or words describing a dance. So we see how much for Wittgenstein, finally, this world of gesture, is the real world, which exists in architecture, which exists in music, which exists in ourselves when we have to respond to this suggestion. And in suggestion, suggestive act, we have to hear gesture. If a thought is suggestive, so inclining you to do something, it's because by itself it's a gesture, and we have to react, to respond to it by a gesture. So you see how much Wittgenstein, I would say in philosophy, was ready to be very much, I would say, a friend to Loos philosophy. And they knew each other at the moment, in the 20s in Wien. And so we could expect that when he had to make a project for his sister, he would apply, or he would follow, or he would respond to the need of making an architecture by what he said about the gesture. We will see that in his house that he built for his sister Margaret in Wien, he was not able, finally, to make a real architectural gesture. Certainly, he built something, but this something which is built in Kuhnmanngasse, according to a program, you have an entrance, bedrooms, living room, etc. To my opinion, and to his opinion, of Wittgenstein's opinion, is not quite an architecture. It's lacking of something. And it's lacking of what? We will see the slide, the photos, and we could compare with Loos architecture. It is lacking of what? What is a work of art for Wittgenstein? He said in the same Culture and Value, within all great art, there is a wild animal, tamed. We have to dominate, to domesticate, to domesticate, to tame the wildness. The house I built for Gretel, so its sister Margaret, is the product of a decidedly sensitive ear and good manners, an expression of a great understanding of a culture, etc. But primordial life, wildlife, striving to erupt into the open, that is lacking. And so you could say it isn't, this house, healthy in the sense of Kierkegaard. It's a hothouse, glass house, plant, not a natural one. In architecture, what is the domain, the ground of this fight, I would say, in between the wild and the great art? What the architect has to tame, I would say, is the space. The space in the sense of Loos' Raumplan, the three-dimensional space. The three-dimensional space which, I would say, resists to be tamed, to be qualified. And there is a struggle in between the architect doing the project and the wild space at his disposal. And he produced architecture when he's ready, when he's capable to master that. And to me, the question of cladding, so the question of giving meaning to the space, qualifying the space, is the method that Loos proposed to follow in order to tame this wild material, which is the three-dimensional space. So Wittgenstein knew finally that he couldn't tame the space. So they built something, but when we go now, we can visit the house. We have a strange feeling of being in front or inside of something which looks like a house, like a project, but which is not quite a project in which we could live. And his sister's family, they had problem to live in it. And that's why probably they wanted in the 70s to sell it, you know, to make it disappearing. And only a big demonstration of solidarity of architects and philosophers, you know, said, no, we have to protect it. And they found, by kind of irony of history, the communist Bulgarian government to buy the house and to protect it, making it its cultural center in Wien. The poor people having nothing to show in that cultural center. So the house now is empty, except on the upper floors in which some people are living, but the main floor, you know, the bel étage, you know, the great architecture is empty. And I get that this emptiness is revealing the truth of this thing, which is not yet an architecture. And you'll see that, going back to the question of ornament and cladding, in the Wittgenstein house, there is no ornament, but there is no cladding. We have bare, yes, technical cladding, a coat laid out on the walls to protect them, inside and outside the same. But it's not in the sense of Loos, and in which even when he wants to be simple and pure outside, inside, where he has to give to the people, you know, the realm to live in, to dwell, there is an incredible flourishing of cladding. So, you see, I would like to advocate to this myth proposed by Semper and Loos, that the origin of architecture is not the structure to which we add the ornament or even the cladding, but the contrary, that the origin of architecture is a cladding. And the first cladding was a textile, was carpet, you know, tapestry. Gottfried Semper tried to demonstrate and to found his demonstration on new archaeological discoveries. So I don't want to discuss the truth, I would say the scientific truth of that proposal, but I would like to consider it as the myths which oppose to Vitruvian, Logier, Quatre Mères de Quincy, etc., tradition, which oppose the primacy of the structure. And in language, we have that, and I would say nested in the proper words that we use in order to defend the primacy of the structure. Is the origin, the etymology of technique, which comes from an Indo-European root, tech, with variation tech, tex, texala, which give birth in Greek to technique, to tekton, so architecton, tecton being the carpenter, architecton, the master carpenter, so the architect, translated into Latin architectura, architecture. But the same root give birth to another family in Latin, the verb tegere, whose past participle is tectum. Tectum is the roof. So we have tegere, which is to cover the roof, tectum. And then we have toga, the toga, which is the formal suit for the Roman citizen. And we have tegula in Latin, which is a tile, so which is a piece of covering, technical covering, part of the roof. The same Indo-European roots gave birth to texere, which means to weave. And so here we open all the world of the weaving. So texere, past participle, textere, textum, so textile. And then text, because a text is nothing but a weaving of words with the syntax as the woof or the loom. So to write a text is to make a certain weaving of elements. Texere, so textile, tissu, in French, tisser. So all this world of weaving, the woven reality of the world. So you see how much the Bekleidung, so the cladding, the clothing, from the origin is a kind of rival of the technique, of the tectonic, which give birth to the structure. And I guess Loos architecture is striving, even if it has not been so much followed, to re-put this textile woven origin of architecture at the first place. So now I would like to show you slides of these buildings to make the comparison in order to understand how the philosophers, Wittgenstein, involved into the building of something, was not finally able to make architecture at the difference of Loos, the architect, who really did architecture into its buildings. Can we have the slides, please? So, Wittgenstein and Loos by Kokoschka. I have to, so the image of the project for the license And Gretel, Margaret Wittgenstein, Wittgenstein's sister, here in a painting by Klimt. So they were very rich, they were part of the upper class, and she wanted really to build a modern palace. What is very strange, and you can see that on the building, on the image, is that it's only 1 month before the beginning of the construction that they select this site. Because in fact, the project had been conceived for a completely different site. It was prepared to be in the core of a block surrounded by mansions and palaces, having in their back a big void, gardens, and so Margaret bought a piece of territory in that internal block. And 1 month, she had the permit to build. 1 month before, she changed her mind and she bought another piece of land, but they kept the project exactly the same. They just moved a little bit the orientation. And so you can see this wall, which is in fact a base to the upper level of the garden. It's not a fence, surrounding an internal garden. It's a supporting device because the street, Kunmangasse, in which it is built, is slightly sloping down. And so the house, I would say, is abstractly laid out onto the urban territory. And to me, there is a feeling of abstraction coming from this project, which comes, I would say, since the beginning by the fact that it has been conceived for a quite different place and without any change in the project itself, built in a quite different condition, quite different site. So, since the beginning, I would say this house is an abstraction. Forward, no? In fact, the project has been launched by Paul Engleman, who was a law student and his assistant, and he was a friend of the Wittgenstein family. And so he was asked by Margaret to make the project. And at the moment in which Wittgenstein, the philosopher, arrived into this affair in summer 26, the poor Paul Engleman was at least at his 10th sketch or hypothesis. And so here we have, and so we see here a project which is opening into itself, protecting itself against the surrounding. But Margaret was not. How to? Right, left. To what direction I have to point to change? Can you do it for me? Excuse me? Okay, so next. Both? On the left side also. And you see the two projects on the right side, the Wittgenstein, and on the left, the Paul Engleman. you see the similarity. Yeah. But, excuse me, the same. No, but there is a problem in. Okay. Yeah. No. So. Yeah. No, but I would like one. Okay, that's correct. And so you see that here. No. Right. Yeah. And if I want. No. Oh. Come on. And then. Okay. So here you see that Wittgenstein had this little box for the entrance compared to the Engleman project. Here you have the general organization of the hall with the stairs, etc. And he had also on the back, on the southern part, these extra rooms to give more room to the staircase and the elevator, the lift. But the general organization, dining room, living room, the hall, the room, terraces on both sides, it's quite the same. So finally, he didn't dare to transform the project. No, definitively, I can't do it. Well, so left, where is left? No. So we go now to the site itself, and you see the slope, and you see the fact that the horizontality was starting there, and at the origin, all that part in which there is this big building was a part of the site, and it's in the 70s that the Wittgenstein sold this to build this big building. So we arrive and we see immediately this thing. Which is a kind of a strange object here into its parcel, and it becomes a kind of Rietveld or Van Desburg composition, you know, and the relationship with the urban fabric around. So if we turn around, we have the impression to have a modernist, purist building. We are accustomed to see such a thing with different characters, with the blank wall, some spectacular effects, which belongs, I would say, to the aesthetics of the first moderns, and a kind of transparency, the house telling its truth, you know, to the outside. So these upper stairs leading to the roof. And if we get inside by the actual entrance, so the little box which is the entrance just protruding out of the facade, and you see the vertical windows with a vertical tracery, no horizontal or minimum of horizontal lines. And we would like to enter by this terrace, which is much more welcoming us, but in fact we have to enter by this little entrance box. And so we can have, a sense of detail. And Wittgenstein was absolutely wanting to have, to avoid any ornament. Even that, this metal leaf sheet which protects the upper part of the wall, and which is making now, after restoration, giving the effect of being something like a cornice, at the origin was not projecting out of the wall. So, in fact, not protecting. So, in fact, it was not really following the rules of the good building. For an aesthetic point of view, in which you wanted to have the pure form, but I would say the form pure, that means before it is transformed into a project, into something real from an architectural point of view. His purism was wanting to keep, the purity of the mental conception of the thing. And so this detail, at the bottom of the wall, to reject the water out of the wall, they have been to convince him to accept, to do that, because he wanted to have really the wall meeting the horizontal plan of the garden directly, without this element of transition, which is the equivalent at the bottom of the cornice on top. So there is a horizontal element here to set the handle. And he wanted all these things so precise, The hole, the keyhole, he had big discussion with the craftsman, discussion of tenths of millimeters. He wanted all that extremely precise. But irony of history has made the door working a little bit, and they have been forced to rub it, to erase a little bit. And so now we see that the kind of perfection, I would say primordial, purist perfection that he wanted to achieve, in fact, is not really done for a real architecture. So if we enter, there is a first box, so you understand that the counter view of that, a first box, a second, the steps, and the landing, which distributes the circulation. And that was according to the original project, or one of the sketches by Paul Engleman. So the stairs, the landing, and you come back on the two aisles, which is a normal, I would say, Baroque structure of most of the palace in Wien. So we climb and we face a blank wall, here is a statue, and two lateral openings, and you come back. So you can see here one of these returned from the entrance. On the top Paul Engleman obviously was preparing something like a capital, if even it was a new interpretation. And you'll see what did Wittgenstein at that point. Keeping, I would say, the structure of the space, but not of the language. So on one side, on the left, there is a kind of curtain wall opening onto the east terrace, and on the right, there is a narrow door opening onto the private part of the house. All the other openings opening onto living rooms and, I would say, the public space of the inside. And so we enter, and so you have these black artificial stone slabs on the floor, and the structure plastered in something which is quite white. And here we can see how much the oblique, the stairs, are disturbing the architectural order. And you know that Alberti, in his treatise describing the question of the stairs, was already quoting this fact that the stairs in a house, in a project, is disturbing the overall organization. And you see that here, well, in between these different elements, there is something disturbing what? The pure order, which have in the other pilasters connected with the horizontal floor, in which you have the absolute contact that he wanted also on the outside, on the base, with the joint of the slab arriving in the middle, and on top, instead of having a capital, which is something blossoming, enlarging, here we have a recessing, as if it was ready to receive a capital which never arrived. And to me here we have a kind of a symbol of the entire project, It's ready, at the moment in which it's ready to be done, but it's not done. And nevertheless it has been built in that stage, which is not completed. In addition, you have these beams, which is not structural, which is just an addition to this recessing of the vertical pillars. As if at the base we had a direct contact in between horizontality and verticality, and at the top we have this articulated contact. And so the rooms, you have these very high glass doors, a kind of homogeneous quality of the space. That means a space, a quality not qualifying, preserving a kind of general homogeneity. Once again, as if we had the space before it is qualified, before it is defined. And according to Loos, not only the light is giving this meaning, specific meaning to specific places, but the cladding also, the treatment of the surfaces. And so the same wish to organize very strictly, to make things corresponding. We have to remember that Wittgenstein has been trained as a civil engineer. So he was accustomed to draw things solid, mechanics, objects, but not spaces, voids. So he focused in that house during the 2 years of the construction on the details, the constructive details that he could master, the mixing of that grate, which is part of the heating system, to have some water in it because the heating comes from the floor, and to give some humidity to that heated air. And then we go to the staircase, which is out of the public scene, but it has attracted Wittgenstein, and the wish to expose the mechanism, of the lift, and to conceive the staircase as something around which has the importance that you have to show. And so we climb, and here we have the covering of the part that he added with an inclined roof. And so we have a kind of glass house which produced very, I would say, picturesque effect. I'm not sure that Wittgenstein would have liked these photos, And once again, you see how much, I guess, when you are not a good architect, you have problem with the oblique. And look how much the plinth of the same staircase has problem to be in continuity with itself. And here, how much these details, show that not an architect was giving the final drawings to the constructors. And if we have some problem at the bottom, we have also at the top. And all this house, so strictly organized with great precision of the meeting of different surfaces, here underneath the steps, I would say the hand of the craftsman is necessary, because how to solve that? And so we can find it, I would say, beautiful and a nice piece of sculpture, but it is contradicting the spirit of the project. Wittgenstein so couldn't manage and couldn't tame, I would say, the space. And here we can see that when a space becomes oblique, so much more difficult than when it is orthogonal or connecting orthogonally different surfaces, well, if you are not an architect, you give up from the project, your own project, and you let the people, the workers, with their hands and their skills, try to reconnect things. And so this famous folded, bent radiator, it's not two radiators, but one, And so he was mad about the idea to make them. He had to find a firm to build them in Germany and not in Austria. To put them in the corner for various reasons, and very simple support at the bottom. To me, it's another demonstration that he was capable, to focus on things and not onto the space. And so he went so far into the invention or the precision of these objects. The same with these handles. which are conceived by an engineer, to work well. And they become a very nice object, but he would refuse, I'm sure, to consider that beautiful. And they are located at a very strong height, very high. Why? Probably coming back to the question of gesture, to make the people feeling that when you open a door, when you handle a door, it's a gesture, it's not only something technical that you have to do, to make you aware that you have to respond to the architecture by the gesture. But I would say here, in his project, it is too literally that he wants us to respond by a gesture. In order to make us behaving and being conscious of the behavior that we unfold into the space, he forces us to make bizarre gesture. And now we move to Loos. And Loos, the first, his first project were just restoration of apartments and not building of new houses. So his first bedroom, or the bedroom for his first wife and for his second wife. And you see how much his theory of cladding, is part of the project. The carpets, are constituting the bed itself, and they are going on the walls. And here even, the night shirt of Madame Loos, is part of all the fabric, the textile. And so here we see how much what is importing is the feeling, the qualification of the space that you want to give to the space. And the structure behind that, disappeared. It is there, actually, but not from the architectural point of view, which is to give a meaning to the space. So what is first is that what not only we see, but we live with. And the walls or the structure behind, we don't mind. No, I'm sorry. So the Villa Muller in Prague, northern facade. And so here also we have a slope. Here also we have from the So a purist image with a smooth plaster. Is there anybody on top? So, what happened? So this one is to show how much this house is settled into a very steep slope. And so the entrance, the level of the entrance on the upper side of the site by the southern facade and so here we see at the difference with the Wittgenstein house how much, even if we have a bare wrapping envelope of the external reality of the house, nevertheless, at this corner, we have, by just the recessing of one facade, we have the composition of this corner, which is finally the signal of the arrival onto the house. And you see how much also the crowning relies by the same sheet of metal, leaf of, I don't know which metal, protecting the upper part of the roof, is transformed into a kind of cornice. And even with very small shifts into the big structure vertically or horizontally by the projecting out of this skyline of the building, Loos is able to produce, I would say, a meaning. Oh, come on. It's broken? Yes, but that okay, so we get inside by the garden, and so another happening is coming, is the entrance porch into the overall simplicity of this envelope. Can't we find another projector? Oh, but here we have to... Okay. And so we are surprised, into this homogeneity and bareness of the general appearance, to have this whole recessing, and with the difference of material. It's really painful. And so you have, the bricks around, but above all, the travertine, very golden and warm of the entrance porch. And so we realized that for Loos, the question is to give meaning, to qualify the space. He wanted the house from the outside to be polite towards its neighbors, so not to manifest, to express too much. But here we are at the point in which we have to welcome the guests or the inhabitants. And it's very discreet, it's very secluded. So now you can give freedom, to the space to express itself in a rich manner. Yeah. Also, in that overall building, which was absolutely orthogonal, now we approach, its utility. We find this kind of curvilinear forms, sweet and smooth. So, in fact, you see the level of the entrance, we go down, and so we will do that, and then we climb up to get to the living room, and we can go back, like you say in Los Angeles, make a right turn, a left turn, etc. You have a kind of three-dimensional grid, which is giving you the explanation of the behavior that you are invited to follow. So we enter this way, very narrow entrance, the vestibule, and then little stairs, very narrow, very tight, and the big opening into the living room. And then immediately starting a stairs which leads to the dining room or continue into the staircase, which at that level distributes bedrooms, etc. So we have to remember that for Loos, the cladding principle was accompanied by the question of the Raumplan. That means the organization of the space as a three-dimensional thing, not a superposition of flat two-dimensional surface. So here, in that site, with the slope of the ground, of the site itself, we will find inside an incredible complexity of the different levels. So here you see we are at that level. So we have stairs coming from the boudoir of the ladies' living room, or this one leading to the dining room, and in between that one, you have another stairs for the service, private, I would say. So there is an incredible amount of different height of spaces. And Loos said that as much as we have to qualify each room by its cladding, we have also to qualify it by its dimensions. And there is absolutely no need to give the same dimension to the living room, and to the dining room, to the bedroom, and to the kitchen. So, for him, the external envelope, is something which should be able to pack together different spaces, different boxes, internal boxes, with their different qualities of dimension, of ambience, of cladding, of measures, and to put them together. And that the art of the architect, that the Raumplanung, to conceive the space since the origin as three-dimensional. On the right, if you please. And that's the difference in between the section of the Wittgenstein house in which you have only the stairs, of the entrance hall. in which you have two heights for the same space. But after that, you have the usual superposition of levels. Instead of here, you have on the different parts. And you are forced to make different sections, because in plan, according to the way you cut, you don't have the same organization of the space. So there is an incredible, and I would say, carefulness of the specificity of each element composing the overall project in the Loos house. So it's the entrance, and you had the travertine, and now you were surprised by the travertine compared to the plaster. And now you have these green plastic epoxy panels, and you pass this door and you enter into the vestibule in which you have these wood white panels, with the blue ceiling, deep blue ceiling. So the contrast in between the exterior and the interior, and the mental contrast that you have in your mind in between the laws of ornament and crime, and here you arrive there and you say, but it's full of ornament. But they are not ornament, these things. They are not added to the structure. The structure, in fact, is behind, and we don't care of it. It's just different materials to differentiate the quality of the spaces. So here it's a very narrow path to get into the living room, into a very bourgeois house. Nevertheless, the dimensions are never, I would say, there is no waste of dimensions. And also is part of the play the treatment of the ground. And the cladding now is no more wood or epoxy, but it becomes this rich marble. And so we enter the living room, opening onto the north facade, and on this its upper part, onto the dining room. So you see that the cladding also is not trying to convince you that all the house is built in marble. It's just a covering, in order to qualify the space. But it's not a house built in marble, Even if it is a rich house, it's not the reason for the marble to be there is not to say, I am a rich house. It's just to give a sense of formality, of richness, but not in the sense of money, to that room. And so it stops, or you understand when you look at it carefully that it's just a cladding, a covering of the structure. And so here, if you make a right turn when you're entrant, you have these stairs and you go to the dining room. So here you can see the thin slabs of marbles, And so that was the entrance, and so to the dining room. But you have another one arriving. So it's I would say nearly every space is a kind of hub. You have a multiplication of the point of distribution. So this bizarre, I would say Chinese tracery And the furniture, you know, which is part of the structure, which is not something added, but which is part of it. And some details, you know, when I saw that for the first time, it's so kitsch. I said, no, it's not by Loos. And it's precisely by Loos, you know. And you have this textile, I would say, presence, which is giving the meaning of the marble, which is in a certain sense a textile transformed into marble. So it's the covering. Remember the carpet of the bedroom of his wife. Finally, these are telling the meaning, confirming what are these walls around, giving the meaning to the space. And so here it's we can go to the dining room, but we can take the stairs going to the bedrooms at the upper level. And so once again here you have a hub, pivot of the entire composition, you know, with the underneath of the stairs, you know, corresponding positive, negative to this pyramid. And so here, once again, we have a kind of model of the entire composition. So the dining room facing the south, here opening onto the living room. So the cladding is constituting the furniture, the cupboards. And so this very strange lamp, unidentified object, flying. And so two openings, one on the east side going to the kitchen, and one on the west side opening onto the central stairs, with this opening onto the boudoir, private living room for the ladies. So you see how much the space is at the same time qualified and open. So that's the kitchen. So obviously different cladding, but appropriate to what we expect from a kitchen. And so just this detail and recessing of the table to make because the door opening, because it's a big bourgeois mansion, but in fact there is a saving of the space, an economy of the space. And Loos used to say that the round plan is an economy of the space, even when you do something for rich people. So that this central staircase, which distributes different spaces, and with the opening onto the ceiling, which is a favorite device in Loos architecture, opening onto the terrace roof. And this is another little space, which is the home office of Mr. Muller. Mahogany, the tiles, and so from this it's confusing because you have mirrors and you have the opening onto that central staircase, and that little piece, a little bit like in Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture, you have the furniture is a kind of model, or the small is a model of what is bigger. At the different levels. And this is the living room, the private living room for the ladies, with 2 levels. So once again, it's a kind of model of the general organization of the house. So we arrive there, we go there, and you have the opening onto the living room. So different colors of cladding, different types of wood. And we can go out at the lower level, taking a little stairs and going back to the living room, in which we find again the marble cladding instead of the wooden one. And here is the bedroom of Madame and Monsieur Muller. So very simple space, I would say modest, with this cladding of wallpaper, the French toile de Jouy, and the dressing room of Mrs. Muller, you know, opening onto the eastern facade, in which the mirrors are not conceived to enlarge the space, but just to be an efficient device to control if you are well dressed. And so the interior of these furnitures, you know, incredible woodwork, so soft, you know, and we were there with the students, you know, we were all, you know, trying to move these drawers so deliciously. And so also there is a quotation of the ambiance of the big liners, you know, crossing the Atlantic. It was the moment in which traveling was a big adventure, and so the people were very well treated with a great comfort, even if the space was reduced into a ship. And here another, I would say, in consequence of this principle of cladding mixed with the round plan in the entrance to the children's room. And so we have the impression, you know, to cross a very thick wall from the outside. And finally we realize that in fact the wall has the normal thickness, but it has been enlarged because there is a furniture, you know, which is giving a solution to what is needed in that room. And so we see how much it is the cladding of the structure which is giving not only the meaning, but what we perceive, you know. And finally, the actual constructive reality of the wall disappeared under what is in between furniture and cladding. So that's the service narrow staircase, and we go to the top. You see that the house, so in 28, 29, was very well equipped by an elevator and a passe-plat, you know, to transport the food from the kitchen to the upper level onto the terrace, in which they had their summer dining room. So here we have the same principle of cladding applied, but with much more modest materials, but the same techniques, you know, this interpenetration of construction of the space and furniture. That's not an accident. And so we reach the terrace roof. So when we go out on our left, there is a blank closed wall. And on the other side, you have this big window opening onto the void, which is, would say, a feature of modern architecture that you can find in Giancarlo De Carlos, in Charles Moore, Port-Zampar, and that we had maybe for the first time in the Ducal Palace in Urbino, the wall closing the hanging sacred garden of the palace. And so we are on the hill on which there is the castle of Prague, and so there is the opening to the east, northeast, and northwest. You remember that that's the lower level of the main avenue. So not only we are on the top of the building, but the building itself is on top of the context of the site. And so this window was intended to frame the castle, not the castle, the church, the main cathedral of Prague, which is a Gothic cathedral, but which has been completed at the moment of the new Republic of Czech Republic in 1918. You know, so they were very much proud to have completed what the Habsburg didn't do for centuries. So for Mr. Muller, active participant of the new Republic as a great industrial, you know, it was a kind of reconnaissance of his dignity to have regard to what the new Republic had done. So the completion of the cathedral. So we can look up, you recognize Steve, or down, and so here we have the terrace and the balcony, terrace of the living room, balcony of the parents' bedroom, and here the little stairs connecting the lower part of the garden with the level of the entrance of the garage. So you see how much outside also we have this Raumplanung conception of the composition of the space. The space is three-dimensional, even outside. And so we can have in this neutrality some excitement, you know, but what impressed me the most is how with nothing, I mean indifferent, because we have the same plaster, you know, but just by the disposition of the volume with a very simple light and not a spectacular one like here, we have all these nuances. And if it is true that meaning comes from differences, here we have a minimalism or a purism. That means how to make the maximum of meaning with the minimum of differences. So here in Wien, the Loos House, in which at the bottom, you know, we have the cladding, but the bottom of the building is considered as belonging to the street. So here, or to piazza, so here we are in the interior of the space, because it's for retail, to attract the customers. The upper part is for housing, so you have to be modest and not to show out what you are, what you do. That's why you have this, because you have two programs, a big store here and housing on top. So the cladding outside here is permitted and even needed because we are considering this part not as the outside of the building, but as the inside of the street. And Loos, you know, on one side, there are these neo-Baroque, neo-classical buildings, and the Palace of the Emperor, you know, which is also 18th, 19th century big cake. But on the other side, you have this very simple and bare facade of Saint Michael and traditional 18th century urban building in Wien. And because he has been blamed, you know, to offend this kind of architecture by the bareness of that, he said, no, these are offending the city of Wien. I am respecting and having regard to the true, humble, modest, urban texture of the city. So one of the most famous church, you know, Gothic, restored and transformed in neoclassical and Baroque times, and this 18th century building. So we can make, it's not that we can make, but Loos did it, you know, this wish to find, and as we are 1 or 2 centuries after, you know, we leave these ornaments, which already were minimal compared to the neo-Baroque and neoclassical. And here, 2 centuries after, the progress going on, we don't need anymore these framings, you know. Here, these flower box, they have been added, demanded by the city hall, you know. It was a kind of compromise that he accepted, you know, to put some ornaments on his facade. And so we have the very rich ground floor and the entrance porch. You remember at a different scale, different materials, with the one of the Villa Muller in Prague, but it's the same thing, a recessing hall, cladded very richly. And so the cladding is so obvious. The marble is not wanting to give the illusion that the building is built in marble. And you can see here, I mean, obviously, in view, you know, no shame, the thin slabs, thin compared to the dimensions of the building. And that's a kind of provocative attitude, because the big columns which support the beam of which frames the entrance are monoliths, are a real piece of marble. But they are laid out on a concrete base which is wrapped by this metal base, you know. So there is a kind of provocation, and we understand a little bit its project for the Chicago Tribune competition. Here, at the same time, in the context of cladding of marbles, we have a real powerful element of full marble, which is crowned by, I don't have the image, by metal capitals and metal base. To affirm and to deny at the same time what you are. And so this house built in the countryside, southwest of Vienna, in which the rich people have their weekend villa in the Semmering Mountains, in which Loos and his friends, Karl Kraus and Arthur Schnitzler, etc., went for the weekend to ride, to bicycle, etc. And we went there at a moment in which the lower part of the territory in Wien was completely foggy, and these are not high mountains, but just over the fog. And so he built a villa for the Dr. Muller, SCI-Arc students arriving with a Vico van. And that's the keeper house. And this house of the Dr. Cooler has been transformed into a little hotel inn in which we can go. We have been. And next time with my SCI-Arc students, Vico Morcote, we will spend some nights there to really experiment Loos architecture. So it has a general silhouette of the traditional mountain house, farmer house, with a flat pitch roof. But the more we approach and the more we consider it, we see that once again there is the question of the cladding, which is playing its game. And so even if there is a borrowing of traditional forms, the borrowing of the traditional material of building in mountain in wood, finally there is the intervention, I would say, of modernity, which is provided by these mobile sliding shutters. And so finally, the original wood is in a certain sense cladded, covered by these shutters.